All right, scholars, I hope you enjoyed reading about the Nez Perce and Chief Joseph, even though it is unfortunate how the story ends. It is important that we learn about these uncomfortable parts of American history, American clashes with the Native Americans. So I had y'all do now, where you guys talked about a promise being made to that was broken, because that is exactly what the Americans did to the Native Americans. Uh, Americans promised that they would not take land away from Native Americans that was out west. That land was reserved for them. They put them on those reservations. But as America's population is getting bigger, as America businesses are getting bigger and needing more resources, people are going to move west. And of course, they're going to have to compete with the Native Americans there. All right, so now we have new interest in the West. Let's go ahead and begin. So new interest in the West, settlers have been gradually forcing Native Americans from their land ever since the first colonists arrived in North America in 1619. But the West, actually, I should say even before 1619 in 1492. But the West was still populated mostly by Native Americans and huge herd of bison by the start of the Civil War. Congress passed two laws that stirred new interest in moving west in 1862. They were the Homestead Act and the Pacific Railway Act. So the Homestead Act offered farmers 160 acres of public land in the West for free. All the farmers or homesteader had to do was to clear the land and farm it for 5 years. And then the homesteader would own the land. So the impact of this new law was huge. It drew hopeful homesteaders west year after year with the promise of free land. And 160 acres is a lot of land. The number of farms in the United States tripled from 2 million to more than 6 million between 1860 and 1910. So the Homestead Act is going to lead to a ton of people wanting to move west for free land. And it's going to also lead to a lot more farms. 6 million, that's a lot. All right, the other act was the Pacific Railway Act, which called for the building of a transcontinental railroad, which would link the Atlantic and the Pacific coast. So a railroad going from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, from one side of America to the other. So this huge project was given to two railroad companies, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific. The Pacific Railway Act kicked off the greatest period of railroad construction in the nation's history. The railroads had placed over 200,000 miles of track by 1900, and much of the track was in the West. So railroads are going to have a huge impact on the West, as now a flood of new settlers are going to be able to move west now that it's a lot easier to get there, right? Instead of going by wagon like the Oregon Trail, now you just hop on a train, right? And you're there in like a day or two. So this is going to include farmers, ranchers, prospectors, preachers, and more than a few crooks. So also like outlaws. This is like where the birth of like outlaw criminals moving out west, because it's not as civilized. So most were just people who thought that the West was a place where a lot of hard work and a little luck could make their dreams come true. Let's continue. All right, so let's look at this photo. You can see our key down here. These are the four different railroad companies, but the two that are going to be given the project to build the transcontinental is going to be Union Pacific and the Central Pacific. So Union Pacific, as you can see, went from New York City all the way west, like through Chicago, all the way where they're going to meet up with the Central Pacific at Promontory Point in Utah. So we're going to get more into that, but I want you to see this map, and these are all the major train lines. All right. All right, railroad builders. So the plan for building a transcontinental railroad looked simple on paper. The Union Pacific would start in Nebraska, then it would build tracks westward across the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains. The Central Pacific would start in California and lay tracks eastward across the mountains of the Sierra Nevadas and then across the Great Basin. And then the two lines would meet somewhere in between the starting points. And the company that laid the most track would receive the most land, more loans, and more profits. So it was a competition. So just one thing to bring up to y'all, this was already established by the Union Pacific in like the 1840s, like before the Civil War. So now everything that we're learning about is going to take place after the Civil War. So the Union Pacific is going to begin over here in Nebraska, like right over here. And the Central Pacific is going to start in San Francisco. It's going to be a lot harder for them as they have to get across the Sierra Nevadas. But the Union Pacific did have to get through the Rocky Mountains. All right, let's go back. All right, so the Union Pacific Railroad got off to a slow start, but then a former Civil War general named Grenville Dodge is going to take charge of construction in 1866, right? So this is a year after the Civil War. So his crew was made up of mostly Irish immigrants who were fleeing the slums of eastern cities, right? Getting out of cities like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, where they didn't like being in these like very, very poor slums with very bad sanitation, right? They would have like 20 people crammed into like a 2-bedroom apartment. So they are joined by other immigrants as well, ex-Civil War soldiers, Mexicans, as well as freed slaves. So all were young men who needed jobs. They were also men who hoped to start new lives in the open spaces of the West. So Dodge's crews were laying as much as 7 miles of track a day across the Great Plains by 1867. And some Native American warriors attacked these work crews. And they would also derail the supply trains, kind of like what Sherman did, by prying up sections of the track. So Grenville Dodge demanded the military help them out and protect them. So soon he's going to have military troops guarding his crew as they are inching their way west by laying down this train track. So for the Native Americans that lived on the plains, like the Sioux, the railroad was an invasion of their homeland, and its construction destroyed their main source of food, as millions of bison were slaughtered to feed railroad workers, right? So a ton of bison are going to be killed, and now they're not going to have food. So some Native American warriors attacked the work crews and derailed the supply trains, right, by prying up the sections of tracks. That's really important for y'all to remember. All right, so the Central Pacific Railroad, right, that other railroad that's coming from San Francisco, they had different problems in California. So many of the workers dashed off to silver mines in Nevada soon after the company began laying track. Others are going to leave for safer jobs, and this is going to bring construction to a stop. So a lot of Americans or people are going to be like, you know what, I can make more money finding silver in Nevada. So there's going to be a silver rush that happens in the late 60s in Nevada. And the Central Pacific Railroad is going to lose a lot of workers, right? Other people are like, this is very dangerous, right? A lot of people are dying building these railroads, mostly through blowing up, using dynamite to blow up holes in mountains so that way the trains could go through, right? Building tunnels. All right. So Central Pacific Railroad is going to look to Chinese laborers and about that came over for the gold rush, but some of them had stayed. So about 12,000 Chinese workers are going to join the Central Pacific, and they're going to work on clearing trees, like chopping down trees, shoveling dirt, blasting tunnels with that dynamite, and laying tracks. And so an estimated 1,000 Chinese workers died in these explosions, like snowslides, like avalanches, or other accidents. And the workers still laid up to 10 miles of track a day, despite these losses. So we saw the Union Pacific was laying down about 7 miles a day. These Chinese immigrants who were working for the Central Pacific are going to work like no other ethnic groups, and they're going to lay down 10 miles of track. So Chinese workers were the fastest of all the ethnic groups working on the railroad, which led to the more hiring of them over other ethnic groups like Mexicans, Irish, Polish, etc. Oops, I put an extra C. So this is going to lead to widespread hatred toward of the Chinese by Americans, right? Americans and other immigrants like Mexicans, Irish, Polish, Italians, etc. They're also not going to like these Chinese because pretty much we're making them look bad, right? The Chinese are working very hard and faster, so they're taking jobs away from other ethnic groups and immigrants, which is going to lead to a lot of dislike of these Chinese workers. All right, let's keep going. The two lines are finally going to come together at Promontory Summit or Promontory Point in Utah Territory on May 10th, 1869, which is today. Crazy, right? What are the odds of that that would happen? So pretty cool. So a golden spike was driven in to complete the 1,800 miles of track. A network of railroads brought new settlers. So now that you have all these railroads, people are going to move out west like never before, and it's going to promote new towns and cities. Cities like Denver, Las Vegas. You're going to have Omaha. There's going to be tons of cities that are just going to be popping up. Minneapolis, Duluth, a ton of towns and cities are going to pop up along these railroad tracks. All right, it's also going to allow mail and supplies to be shipped freely across the country, right, and super quickly as well. So now mail and goods can move out west. So the Chinese workers had contributed so much to building the railroad, but they were not acknowledged at the celebration. So at the celebration, we'll look at a picture of it. Even though they did most of the work, they're not going to get any credit. So their reward for years of hard work was to lose their job. So after this is completed, the Central Pacific Railroad is going to fire all of these Chinese laborers, right, to hire white Americans. And so a few of them did fulfill their dreams of returning to China, richer than when they came, but most of them stayed in America, especially on the West Coast in California, and they're going to help build new farms and businesses across the West. All right, here's a picture of that celebration at Promontory Point. You have the Union Pacific on the right, and then the Central Pacific on the left. And if you notice, you don't see any Chinese in this picture, even though they're the ones who built the railroad. So pretty astonishing. All right, y'all, go ahead and y'all are going to head on over to Google Classroom. You're going to complete cycle 2 of your Google form. You will have 8 minutes to complete this. When you are done, go ahead and put done in the chat or put your Chromebooks at half mast. And I will see y'all back here on Wednesday as we're going to continue talking about the tensions in the West between Native Americans and the Americans that are moving there. All right, y'all, have a great day.